Hello and welcome to Good Night English. Tonight, I will read a special story for you. It is Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. Listen, relax, and enjoy this bedtime English. Now let's begin. 2 stations beyond Dresden, an elderly gentleman entered our compartment, made a polite general greeting and then, raising his eyes, nodded to me in particular as if to affirm acquaintance. For a moment or two I could not think who he was, but when he gave his name with a gentle smile, I immediately recalled him. He was one of the most highly regarded antiquarian art dealers in Berlin, and before the war I had often browsed through and bought his books and autographs. We chatted at first on trivial matters. Then suddenly he said, "I must tell you where I have just been, because in all my long experience of 37 years as a dealer, nothing quite so strange has ever happened to me. I imagine you know yourself how things are in the art market at present, with the value of money evaporating into thin air. The nouveau riches have discovered a sudden liking for Gothic Madonnas and early printed books and old prints and pictures. You just can't conjure up enough of it for them, and sometimes you have to stop them getting into your own home and stripping it bare. If they could, they would buy the cufflinks from your shirt and the lamp from your desk. It makes it harder and harder to get new stuff in. Forgive me for using a word like stuff for objects that you and I are accustomed to revere, but dealing with these terrible people eventually gets you into the habit of thinking of a wonderful Venetian incunabulum as a repository for so and so many dollars and a Gersino asterisk drawing as the embodiment of a few hundred Swiss francs. There's no resisting the forceful urging of customers suddenly intent on buying everything up. The other morning I was clean out of stock again, and I felt like lowering the blinds in shame at the sight of the shop, which had belonged to my father and grandfather, now containing only the sort of pitiful trash that in the old days not even a hawker in the northern suburbs would have put in his cart. In this dilemma, I hit on the idea of going through our old ledgers to see if I could unearth any former customers that I might winkle a few duplicate items out of. A list of old customers is always more or less a roll call of the dead, especially in times like these, and I didn't gain much. Most of those who used to buy from us had long since had to sell their possessions at auction or had died, and the few that were still on their feet didn't look at all promising. Then suddenly I came upon a whole bundle of letters from probably our oldest customer, who had slipped from my memory because since the outbreak of the World War in 1914 we had never had any kind of order or query from him. The correspondence, and I'm not exaggerating, went back almost 60 years. He had bought from my father and my grandfather, and yet I couldn't recall ever having seen him enter the shop in the 37 years that I had worked there. Everything pointed to his being an eccentric, slightly comical old fogey, one of those odd German characters that Menzel and Spitzweg asterisk painted, now almost extinct but still to be found here and there in small provincial towns until very recently. His letters were in a copperplate hand, with sums of money underlined with a ruler in red ink, and he always set out figures twice to avoid the possibility of error. This and the fact that he only ever wrote on detached flyleaves and used the cheapest envelopes indicated the pettiness and fanatical thrift of an irredeemably provincial mind. He invariably signed these curious documents with his name followed by his full style and title: Forestry and Agriculture Counselor, Rhett, Lieutenant, Rhett, Bearer of the Iron Cross First Class. Being a veteran of the 1870 war, asterisk, he must have been at least 80 if he was still alive. As a collector of old prints, however, this ridiculous penny-pinching crank showed a most unusual shrewdness, deep knowledge, and superb taste. As I slowly pieced together his orders over an almost 60-year period, the first ones with prices in silver groschen, I realized that, in the days when you could buy dozens of top-quality German woodcuts for a thaler, this little provincial must have quietly assembled a collection of copper engravings that could easily hold its head up next to the much-trumpeted ones of the newly rich. What he had acquired from us over half a century in orders worth a few marks and pfennigs each would, on its own, represent an astonishing value today, and there was no reason to suppose he hadn't picked up just as many bargains at auction and from other dealers. After 1914, there had been no further orders from him, but I was too familiar with what went on in the art market for the auction or private sale of a hoard like his to have passed me by. In other words, either the peculiar man was still alive or the collection was in the hands of his heirs. I was intrigued by it all, and the next day, yesterday evening, I set off without delay for one of Saxony's most hopelessly parochial towns. As I strolled from the station along the main street, I could scarcely believe that anyone living here, in a room in one of these banal, kitschy buildings full of petty bourgeois junk, could possess complete, mint collections of Rembrandt etchings and Dürer and Montaigne engravings. To my amazement, though, when I inquired at the post office next morning whether a forestry and agriculture counselor of his name resided in the town, I was told that the old gentleman was indeed still alive. Just before midday, I made my way to his address, and I will admit my heart was racing a little. I had no trouble finding his flat. It was on the second floor of one of those shoddy provincial edifices knocked up in a hurry by speculative builders in the 1860s. A respectable master tailor occupied the first floor. To the left on the second was the gleaming nameplate of a post office administrator, while a porcelain plaque to the right bore the forestry counselor's name. I rang tentatively, and the door was opened straight away by a very elderly, white-haired woman in a fresh black cap. I handed her my card and asked if the counselor was at home. Surprised and somewhat suspicious, she glanced at me and then at my card. In this old-fashioned building and this benighted little town, it seemed that a visitor from the outside world was quite an occurrence. But she kindly bade me wait and took the card inside. I heard her soft whispering and then suddenly a thunderous male voice. "Ah, Mr. R. of Berlin, from the famous antiquarian firm. Show him in, show him in. I'll be delighted." And the little old lady shuffled hurriedly back and ushered me into the parlor. I took off my hat and coat and went in. Standing in the middle of the modest room was an old but erect and vigorous man with bushy mustaches, dressed in a slightly military-looking frogged house jacket. Both of his hands were cordially extended towards me, but the frank, cheery spontaneity of this mode of greeting seemed at odds with a strange rigidity in his posture. He also made no move towards me, and so I, somewhat discomposed, had to walk right up to him to shake his hand. And as I did so, I perceived from the stiff horizontal position of his hands that they were awaiting rather than seeking mine. A second later I understood. The man was blind. Ever since childhood, I have always felt ill at ease in the presence of the sightless. I can never get over a sort of shame and embarrassment at perceiving a living person in front of me and knowing that he can't perceive me in the same way. Here again I had to overcome an initial shock when I saw those lifeless eyes staring fixedly into empty space under their bushy white brows. But the blind man left me little time for discomposure, for my hand had no sooner touched his than he shook it forcefully and continued his greeting with hearty, stentorian effusiveness. "A rare visitor indeed," he said with a broad smile. It really is quite something for one of the great Berlin gentlemen to stray into our little backwater. But a major dealer traveling by train to see a customer should set alarm bells ringing. Where I come from, people always say, keep your doors and purses closed when the gypsies come to town. Yes, I've got a pretty good idea why you've sought me out. Business is depressed in our poor, down-at-heel Germany, and there are no more buyers, so the big men start remembering their old customers and try rounding up a few sheep. But you won't have any luck with me, I'm afraid, because poor old pensioners like me are glad if we can afford bread for our table. We can't keep up with the crazy prices that things fetch now. Our sort are shut out for good. I hastened to reassure him that I had not come to sell him anything, but that, being in the area, I had not wanted to miss the opportunity of paying my respects to a long-standing customer of our firm and one of Germany's greatest collectors. Hardly had the last phrase passed my lips when a curious change came over the old man's face. He was still standing rigidly upright in the middle of the room, but now an expression of innermost pride radiated from him. He turned to where he thought his wife would be, as if to ask if she had heard. Then, facing me again, he replaced the gruff, military tone he had just been using with a joyful voice that was soft, even tender. That really is very, very decent of you, and you shan't have come in vain. You'll see something you don't see every day, not even in your flashy Berlin. A few pieces as good as any in the Vienna Albertina, or in Paris. God damn the place. Yes, when a man's been collecting for 60 years, he gathers up quite a few things that aren't knocking about on every street corner. Now, Louise, give me the key to the cabinet. Then something unexpected occurred. The little old lady, who had been standing next to him in a polite, friendly way and smiling softly as she listened to our conversation, suddenly held up both hands towards me in an imploring way and at the same time vigorously shook her head. At first these gestures puzzled me, but then she walked up to her husband and laid her hands gently on his shoulders. Really, Hermann, she pleaded, you haven't asked the gentleman if he has time to see the collection right now. It's coming up to midday, and after lunch you must rest for an hour, as the doctor has expressly ordered. Wouldn't it be better to show the things to the gentleman in the afternoon, and then we'll drink a cup of coffee together? Anne-Marie will be here by then, and she knows so much more about it and can help you. No sooner were the words out of her mouth than she made the same insistently imploring sign to me as before, unsuspected by the man next to her. Now I understood. She wanted me to decline an immediate viewing, and so I quickly invented a lunch engagement. It would be a pleasure and an honor to be permitted to see his collection, I said, but this would scarcely be possible before 3 o'clock. However, at that time I'd be happy to return. With the testiness of a child deprived of its favorite toy, the old man turned around. Of course, he said sulkily, Berlin gentlemen never have time for anything. Today you'll have to set some time aside, though, because it's not just a handful of pieces we have to look at, but 27 portfolios, each for a different master, and none of them half empty. So 3 o'clock, then. But don't be late, or we won't get through it all. Once more he stretched his hand into empty space towards me. Take it from me, you'll be pleased with what you see or envious. And the more envious you are, the better pleased I'll be. That's collectors for you. Everything for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. And again he shook my hand with vigor. The little old lady accompanied me to the door. Throughout my visit I had noticed a certain uneasiness in her, a look of embarrassment and anxiety. Now, just as I was leaving, she addressed me in a stuttering, careworn voice. Would you mind if my daughter Anne-Marie came to see you before you return here? It would be better for various reasons. I expect you're lunching at your hotel. Certainly, I'd be delighted. It would be a pleasure, I said. And so, an hour later, just as I had finished my midday meal in the small restaurant of the hotel on the market square, a simply dressed old maid walked in and scanned the room. I went up to her, introduced myself, and said I was ready to set out with her to view the collection. At this she colored and, with the same confused embarrassment her mother had shown, asked if she might say a few words to me beforehand. I saw straight away that she was rather at a loss. Again and again she tried to pull herself together and speak, but each time her cheeks and forehead were suffused with blushes and she fumbled with her dress. At last the halting, often muddled flow of her words commenced. My mother sent me here to meet you. She's told me everything, and we've a great favor to ask of you. We'd like you to know, before you go and see Father, Father will of course want to show you his collection, and his collection isn't quite complete anymore. A number of items are missing. In fact, rather a lot, I'm afraid. Again, she had to catch her breath. Then abruptly she looked me in the face and hurried on. I must be quite frank with you. You know how the times are, and so you'll understand. Shortly after the war broke out, Father became completely blind. Previously, his eyesight had often been impaired, but the agitation he went through destroyed it for good. You see, although he was already 76, he was determined to follow the campaign into France, and when the army didn't push forward in the same way as in 1870, he got dreadfully worked up and his eyesight deteriorated at a terrifying speed. Otherwise, he's still hale and hearty, and until recently he could walk for hours and even indulge his passion for hunting. But his rambles are now a thing of the past, and the only pleasure he has left is his collection, which he looks at every day. That's to say, he doesn't actually see it, he can't see anything, but every afternoon he gets out all the portfolios so that he can at least touch the sheets, one by one, always in the same order that he has known by heart for decades. Nothing else interests him anymore, and I always have to read anything relating to auctions in the paper to him, and the higher the prices the happier he is, because that's the terrible thing. Father doesn't understand the reason for those prices or the times we're living in. He doesn't know that we've lost everything and that his monthly pension won't keep us for 2 days in a month. Then there's the fact that my sister's husband fell in the war and left her with 4 small children. But Father knows nothing of our material difficulties. At first we made savings, even more than before, but that didn't help. Then we started to sell things, of course, without touching his beloved collection. We sold our odds and ends of jewelry, but God knows that didn't amount to much, because for 60 years Father had spent every spare pfennig on his prints. One day there was nothing left to part with. We didn't know what to do, and then, Mother and I sold one of the prints. Father would never have allowed it, but he doesn't know how bad things are. He has no idea how hard it is to get a little food on the black market. He doesn't even know that we've lost the war and that Alsace and Lorraine have been surrendered. We don't read him things like that from the paper anymore in case he gets worked up. It was a really valuable piece that we sold, a Rembrandt etching. The dealer offered us many thousands of marks for it, and we hoped it would maintain us for years. But you know how money just melts away. We deposited most of it in the bank, and 2 months later it was all gone. So we had to sell another piece and then another, and the dealer always delayed payment until the money had lost its value. Then we tried our luck with auctions, but we were cheated there too, despite prices in the millions. By the time we received those millions, they were no more than worthless paper. In this way, the best parts of the collection gradually fell away, all apart from a few good pieces, just so that we could keep body and soul together, and Father doesn't suspect anything. That's why my mother was so alarmed when you came today, because as soon as he opens up the portfolios for you, the secret will be out. You see, we replaced the items we sold with later copies or similar sheets, inserting them in the same mounts, which he knows individually by touch, so that he doesn't notice anything when he feels them. As long as he can feel them and count through them, he has the precise order lodged in his memory. He gets the same pleasure as in the past when he could see them with his eyes. There's no one in this little town that Father ever thought worthy of being shown his treasures, and he adores every single sheet with such a fanatical love that I think it would break his heart if he ever guessed they had long ago passed out of his hands. You're the first person he has ever wanted to show his collection to in all the years since the former director of the Dresden Print Gallery died. So I beg you, the old maid suddenly raised her hands, and her eyes glistened with tears. We beg you, don't make him unhappy. Don't make us all unhappy. Don't shatter his illusions. Help us to make him believe that all the prints he'll describe to you really are there. If he even suspected anything, he wouldn't survive the shock. Maybe we haven't done right by him, but what else could we do? We had to get by somehow, and surely human lives, my sister's 4 fatherless children, matter more than engraved sheets of paper. To this day, his pleasure in them has been diminished not a whit by what we've done. He is happy to be able to spend 3 hours every afternoon leafing through his portfolios, talking to each piece as if to a person. And today might be his happiest day. For years he's been waiting for the chance to show off his darlings to a real connoisseur. So I implore you by everything that's sacred, please don't destroy his pleasure. I can't possibly convey how deeply her words affected me. Heavens knows, as a dealer you come across plenty of people like this who have been grossly deceived by inflation and then cheated by abject scoundrels who swindle them out of precious old family heirlooms for the price of a sandwich. But here fate had added a special touch that moved me even more. Naturally, I promised her I would do my best to keep the secret. We set off together, and on the way I learnt to my disgust what trifling sums of money these poor ignorant women had been fobbed off with. But this only strengthened my resolve to make every effort to help them. We went up the stairs, and hardly had she unlatched the door when the old man's joyful, clamorous voice resounded from the parlor, "Come in, come in." With a blind man's acute hearing, he must have picked up our footfall on the stairs. Hermann was so impatient to show you his treasures that he hasn't slept a wink, said the little old lady with a smile. A fleeting glance from her daughter had already assured her of my acquiescence in their scheme. Spread out on the table ready for viewing were piles of portfolios, and no sooner had the blind man felt my hand in his than he took my arm and, without further greeting, pressed me down into a chair. "Right? We'd better start right away. There's a lot to see, and you Berlin gentlemen never have any time. This first portfolio is devoted to Dürer and pretty well complete, as you'll see, with each specimen more beautiful than the last. Well, you can judge for yourself. Now look at this." And he turned to the first folio, the large horse. Asterisk, and then, delicately using his fingertips with the tender, protective care suitable for something fragile, He removed from the folio a mount containing a blank sheet of yellowed paper. Excitedly, he held this worthless scrap in front of him, and for several minutes he stared at it without seeing it. As his splayed fingers held the blank sheet at eye level, his whole face expressed the ecstasy of a spellbound observer. All at once the lifeless pupils of his rigidly fixed eyes shone. Was it a reflection from the page or an inner luster? With a mirroring brightness, the light of recognition. "Now," he said proudly, "have you ever seen a finer print? Every detail stands out so sharp and clear. I've compared it with the one in Dresden, but that was much more flat and dull-looking. And as for the provenance..." He turned the sheet over and pointed with his fingernail at precise spots on the equally blank verso, so that I involuntarily looked to see if there weren't any marks there after all. "There you have the stamp of the Nagler collection, and here the one of Remy and Estelle. I don't suppose those illustrious owners ever imagined their print would find its way into my little room here." It sent shivers down my spine to see the unsuspecting man praise an entirely blank sheet with such enthusiasm, and there was something uncanny in seeing how he used his fingernail to indicate to the millimeter the invisible collector's marks that existed only in his fancy. I was so horrified that my throat tightened and I was unable to reply. But when in my perplexity I looked up at the two women, I saw his wife tremble with emotion and beseechingly raise her hands. So I pulled myself together and began to play my role. "Extraordinary," I stammered at last. "A marvelous print." At once his whole face glowed with pride. "But that's nothing at all," he exulted. "Wait till you see this Melancholia, or this here Passion, an illuminated work that can hardly have its equal for quality. Now just look." And again his fingers ran caressingly over the imaginary picture. Such freshness, such warm, grainy hues. The big Berlin dealers and museum curators would be all agog if they could see this. On it went for fully 2 hours, this spate of triumphant eloquence. I really can't tell you how weird it felt, looking with him through 100 or 200 blank scraps of paper or paltry reproductions, which to the unsuspecting mind of this tragic figure were so unutterably real that he could give detailed, admiring descriptions of each one and knew unerringly where it came in the sequence. An invisible collection, long since scattered to the four winds, but for this blind man, this touchingly deluded man, it was still right in front of him, and his mind's eye beheld it with a fervor so overwhelming that I almost came to believe in it myself. Only once was there an alarm that threatened to interrupt his enthusiasm and wake him from his sleepwalker's certainty. He had taken up Rembrandt's Antiope and was again praising the sharpness of the print. As he did so, his nervously discerning finger sought lovingly to trace a line of impression that the replacement sheet did not present to his heightened sense of touch. Suddenly a shadow seemed to darken his brow and his voice faltered. This is Antiope, isn't it?" he muttered, a little embarrassed, whereupon I cranked myself up, quickly took the mounted sheet from his hands and gave an enthusiastic and minutely detailed description of the etching, which I was also familiar with. As I did so, the blind man's features relaxed and his embarrassment vanished. And the more praises I sang, the more his gnarled, stale personality blossomed into jovial warmth and sincere, heartfelt joy. "What it is to find someone who understands these things," he rejoiced, turning in triumph to his wife and daughter. "At long last, someone who can make you realize too what my prints are worth." You've always been so distrustful and carping because I put all my money into my collection. And it's true. For 60 years I had no beer, no wine, no tobacco, no travel, no theater, no books, just saving and saving for these prints. One day you'll see, though, when I'm not around anymore, then you'll be rich, richer than anyone in this town, as rich as the richest in Dresden, and then you'll be glad of my little infatuation. But for as long as I live, not one of these prints leaves the house. They'll have to carry me out before my collection goes anywhere. And as he spoke, his hand tenderly stroked the long, empty portfolios as if they were living creatures. It was terrible, but at the same time moving, for through all the years of the war I had not seen such a look of pure, unmitigated bliss in any German face. Beside him stood the two women, mysteriously resembling the female figures in that etching by the German master who, having come to visit the Savior's tomb, now stand before the breached, open vault with an expression of horrified awe, but also the ecstasy of wondrous adoration. Just as those female disciples are bathed in the light of the divine revelation before them, so these two aged, careworn, impoverished, petty bourgeois women were illuminated by the childlike bliss of the old man. They smiled through their tears, a sight more moving than any I have ever seen. Meanwhile, he could not get enough of my praise. He added more and more sheets to the pile in front of him and turned them this way and that, eagerly drinking in my every word. It came as quite a relief to me when the spurious portfolios were at last put aside and he reluctantly let the table be cleared for the coffee things. But what was my guilty sigh of relief compared with the swell of his tumultuous joy, the exuberance of an old man who now seemed 30 years younger. He told 1,000 anecdotes of his purchases and fishing expeditions, struggled again and again to his feet, rejecting all assistance, to fetch out another sheet and then another. He was as boisterous as a man intoxicated by wine. When I eventually said it was time for me to leave, he was frankly startled, as peevish as an obstinate child. He defiantly stamped his foot and said it would not do, as I had scarcely seen half of the total. The women were hard put to overcome his stubbornness and vexation and make him understand that if he held me back any longer I would miss my train. After offering some desperate resistance, he at last acquiesced, and when it came to parting his voice grew quite soft. He took hold of my hands, and his fingers caressed them up to the wrists with all the affection that a blind man is able to put into his touch, as if he were seeking to know me better and express more affection than words could convey. "Your visit has given me a great deal of pleasure, a great deal," he began, with a convulsion emanating from deep within him that I'll never forget. "It really has done me a power of good, finally to be able to look through my beloved prints again with a connoisseur. But I want you to know that you haven't come to a blind old man in vain. I promise you here and now, with my wife as witness, to insert a clause in my will that entrusts the auction sale of my collection to your venerable firm. You shall have the honor of being custodians of these unknown treasures," and he placed his hand lovingly on the plundered portfolios, "until the day when they are dispersed far and wide. Just promise me to make a handsome catalogue. That will be my memorial, and I couldn't ask for a better one." I looked at his wife and daughter, who were huddled together, and sometimes a tremor passed from one to the other as if they were a single body quivering in a shared commotion of feeling. I myself felt solemn at how the touchingly oblivious man had entrusted his invisible, long-dispersed collection to me as if it were a thing of great value. Deeply affected, I made a promise I could never fulfill. Again his lifeless pupils brightened. I sensed that an inner yearning made him want to touch me again, and I felt the tender, loving pressure of his fingers as they held mine to reiterate his thanks and the vow he had made. The women accompanied me to the door. They dared not speak, because his sensitive ears would have picked up every word, but the happy faces they turned to me were streaming with hot, grateful tears. I felt quite numb as I groped my way down the stairs. To be honest, I was ashamed. There I was, like an angel in a fairy tale who had stepped into a poor dwelling and made a blind man see for an hour, if only by conniving in a benign deception and lying brazenly. I, who in truth had come as a shabby hawker in the hope of cunningly prizing a few valuable pieces from someone's grasp. What I had in fact come away with was worth much more. Amidst the doom and gloom of the present age, I had once again been permitted to experience directly an unsullied enthusiasm, a sort of spiritually illuminated ecstasy focused on art itself, a sentiment that people today seem to have long forgotten. And I felt a kind of reverence, I can't put it any other way, although I was still ashamed without quite knowing why. I was already in the street below when I heard an upstairs window being rattled open and my name called out. And there he was, the old man, unwilling to let me go without training his blind eyes in the direction he assumed I would take. He leant so far out that the two women took the precaution of holding on to him, and he waved his handkerchief and shouted, "Have a safe journey," with the fresh, cheerful voice of a boy. It was an unforgettable sight. The happy face of the white-haired man in the window, floating above all the dour, busy, harried people in the street, gently borne aloft from our repugnant everyday world on a white cloud of kindly illusion. And I had to think of the truth of an old saying, "Gird as I think. Collectors are happy people." Thank you for listening to Good Night English. I hope this story helped you to relax and feel calm. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and sleep well. Good night.